Whoa!
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Amanda Ashkenazi, and I'm the Director of Education at HR Canada Charitable Organization. Tonight's conversation comes at a critical moment. In the weeks since the US and Israeli-led operation against the Iranian regime began, the Middle East has entered a new and deeply uncertain phase, one that may have far-reaching, even generational consequences. What we're witnessing is not only a military confrontation, but potentially a broader geopolitical shift with implications that extend well beyond the region. We're very pleased to be joined tonight by Jonathan Conricus, former international spokesperson for the IDF and now a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Jonathan brings a rare combination of operational experience and strategic insight and will help us understand what has already been achieved, what may come next, and what this moment means for Iran, Israel, and the future of the Middle East. The conversation will be hosted by Alex Pierson, one of Canada's most prominent radio broadcasters and political commentators. Known for her sharp and direct approach, Alex will guide us through a discussion that goes beyond the headlines, into the strategic, political, and ideological dimensions of this conflict. And of course, we'll also be examining how this war is reverberating here at home in Canada, where we're seeing rising anti-Semitism, the targeting of Iranian dissidents, and serious questions about the role of governments and law enforcement in responding to these challenges. Thank you again for being here, and I'll turn it over now to Alex to begin the conversation.
Thanks so much. There's been, sadly, too much to talk about over the last couple of years, and John has certainly been at the forefront of a lot of these conversations. John, let's start. I mean, we've come now from October 7th now, and this is now a new conflict, but it very much is attached to the last conflict, right, of October 7th. And so it seems to be changing hour to hour. And I think at this point, while regime change is not talked about, and while we're seeing a lot, militarily be certainly destroyed by Israel and the United States, I think there is a lot of confusion as to where this goes. Can you inform or give us some clarity, if there is any, as to what is the objective? And is it the same for the United States as it is for Israel?
Yeah, so shalom and good evening, Alex. Great to be here. Great to be doing this webinar with Honest Reporting Canada, an organization that I definitely believe in. And if you're here watching, then all the credit to you for supporting this organization. Tremendously important work. I see how media narratives are shaped, how people spin, and how Israel is many times portrayed in a very unfair and biased and negative way in international media. And Honest Reporting, and specifically in Canada, is one of very few organizations that serves as a counterweight against that. So from the beginning, before we get into Iran, Hezbollah, and Houthis, and all the nasty stuff about this war, and the positive things, because we will speak about a few of the opportunities as well, let me just begin by saying that this is a great place to be, and I hope you will find this uplifting and useful and informative. Now, as to the question, I think the objectives are different. US has different objectives. Israel has different objectives. They overlap to a certain extent, but they are not identical. Where do they differ? I think with the tolerance for an existing regime. Israel, even though not officially said so yet by any meaningful Israeli politician, I think Israel would strive for an end state that sees the undoing of this Islamist crazy regime. And on the other hand, I think that the US would be content with the regime existing, but in a much more neutral and neutered way, without nuclear weapons, without ballistic missiles or the ability to manufacture them, and without controlling the Hormuz Strait, and without being a regional bully. That, by the way, is common Israel and the US. Those four key pillars, I think Israel, for Israel, it's very clear that need to be achieved. But where Israel differs from the US is because we have skin in the game and because our civilians, Israeli civilians, are at the forefront of Iranian aggression. I think that what Israel wants to achieve is a bit more than what the US will suffice with. Important to keep in mind, perspectives are different. The US is many thousands of kilometers away. This is our backyard, almost literally speaking, and therefore it's so much closer and much more vivid for Israelis, and there's more tolerance for threats and issues from a US perspective than there is one in Israel. Now, leaders have been very careful not to set the bar too high or very high, because they know that they will be measured by whether or not this war achieves those aims. So Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, they've been careful not to say this war will end with an undoing of the Iranian regime. I think, and this is just my personal observation and belief, that both leaders want that to happen. Both leaders are directing their militaries to take action in order for that to be the case and to facilitate the transition of power from this horrible oppressive regime to the Iranian people and to some less negative, less hostile, less belligerent form of government, hopefully democratic, hopefully respecting of human rights and civil liberties. But I think we have to temper our expectations when it comes to new regimes in the Middle East. So to summarize, there's daylight and difference and varying levels of success between the US and Israel, lots of overlap. And when will this become apparent? If and when the Iranian regime will be smart enough to ask for a ceasefire with reasonable conditions, then maybe we'll see whether the US will be willing to say, okay, let's stop it now, and Israel will want to continue to actually obliterate the regime. But that, I think, is still a few weeks away.
Yeah, I mean, there's domestic pressures certainly for Mr. Trump, and then there's security pressures and realities for Israel. And certainly then in the Middle East, there is this opportunity here where, we may possibly have a new Middle East if the dominoes fall where we hope they do. But again, hope's not a strategy. And there are so many unknowns. Is there a concern, John, that, domestic with the oil prices going up, that domestic pressure is going to change the narrative, at least on the Trump side? And so that Israel, we've seen it time and time again, certainly since October 7th and certainly throughout history, the alienation, the casting as the guilty party all the time, right? And so is there a concern the longer this goes on and the pressures of domestic politics play for Mr. Trump that Israel will be found again isolated and having to fight something that is probably not going to end just overnight? Even if we take the regime out, there's still a terror all over the world, because that's what Iran does, is they ship it around the world. So it doesn't just go away.
No, it doesn't go away, Alex, but it will significantly decrease if the regime is undone or toppled, and if it's significantly weakened. But I agree very much with the fact that you put October 7 into the mix of the conversation here, because what we're seeing unfolding since October 7 is basically the steady demise of the Iranian regime. They spent a lot of time, a lot of resources, a lot of money and talent and creativity in building this ring of fire around Israel, in arming different terror organizations, in politicizing or radicalizing a lot of Arabs around Israel, with the purpose of being able to really overthrow or annihilate the state of Israel. A lot of people don't know that. And when you speak about how Israel is portrayed in the media, I've had that question so many times fielded at me, like, why is this war justified? And why is Iran an enemy? And then I go back and say, well, it's very basic. I mean, it's not even a challenge here. Iran says and openly pursues a strategy by which they want to destroy the state of Israel by the year no later than 2040. They say it and they do it. And they try to develop nuclear weapons, and they have ballistic weapons, and they manufacture and sell weapons to terrorists, and they arm terror organizations. So from an Israeli perspective, it's pretty straightforward why this needed to happen now. Media-wise, Israel, there's the old saying, or the old balance thing of good cop, bad cop. Israel is the bad cop. That's the role. That's what we've been casted like. We're the bad cop, and the U.S. is supposedly the good one. We're the ones, the attack dog that's pulling at the leash and wants to do more and is more aggressive, whereas the U.S. can allow itself to be a little bit more of a tempering and strategic effect. Not entirely sure that reflects reality. I think both countries are pretty straightforward when it comes to fighting Iran, but that is definitely how it also is useful and convenient for the US to have Israel portrayed in this sense. And it's kind of a pressure valve where it releases some pressure from the US because there's Israel to focus on. And I don't think that anybody watching this conversation or listening, or you or I, were surprised by how Israel was portrayed and framed in this entire thing. A lot of it, a lot of the criticism is focused on Israel, and Israel is, front and center of the opposing thoughts against the war. Now, domestically, I think it's a chance, of course. In any democracy, leaders are very sensitive to public sentiment. But I think, without having a lot of, expertise on the topic, but when I look at President Trump, he looks different in my unsavvy political eyes than other American presidents in his ability to weather a storm and to deal with either fake or real pressure that is domestic. And the way that he's been doing that, I think, is quite interesting to analyze and to learn from, to see how he's able to, take a topic and then kind of dismantle it, take the sting out of it, and move on to the next one. And he's done that pretty successfully with this conflict. If we take, for instance, MAGA supporters or Republican support for this war, mainstream media, and in Canada as well, the headline was, Republicans do not support the war. Trump shrugged and said, well, no, they actually support it, and I'll have numbers to show. And then it came out, even by CNN and NBC, which probably aren't, favorably inclined to the president and his policies, overwhelming support within the Republican Party and somewhat of support amongst the Democrats for the U.S. war against Iran. And that's a good topic. Now, oil prices, again, no expert, but I've listened to people who are experts, and I think this time around, this isn't 1973. For people here watching who were adults at the pump in 1973 and 4, when Arab countries placed an oil embargo on Israel, and that's caused prices to skyrocket, I don't think that's going to happen, at least not in the US. Why? Because the US is in a totally different strategic position in terms of domestic production. They can offset domestically anything that happens in the Middle East. Now, the US cannot control, as far as I understand, global prices of Brent and crude oil. That cannot be controlled in the same way. But in terms of American civilians feeling the pain in 50 cents, $1 more for a gallon, I don't think that's going to happen, because the US can artificially offset that with local production. And since it's so important politically, I'm pretty sure that is what the administration will be busy doing and preempting.
Don't worry, John. We'll find some way to blame Israel for that too. So, with the cost of living crisis going on in Canada, certainly it will not surprise me, at least, if the finger of blame goes to Netanyahu. Having said all that, there's the fog of war, and then there's the political fog of war. And, in Canada, I don't need to tell you what's been going on. You've got a government that's flipped and flopped and flopped and flipped and been basically spineless to take a position, or actually take a moral position. I think in this conflict since October 7th, Trudeau did not make contact with Mr. Netanyahu. We know where he stood on this. Mr. Carney seems to be having trouble figuring out, is he in, is he out, does he support, does he not? And so again, we go back to the domestic pressures of what the polls will say is needed, and then what is actually needed. And the bottom line is, at least for Mr. Carney, the position I think will come down to what plays best politically. And so then how does that change things? Because the politics of this since October 7th, certainly the propaganda put forward by the terror groups of Hezbollah, of Iran, and certainly Hamas has been so successful. Israel may have the weaponry, but the weaponry of propaganda has been so successful that when we poll on the issue of who's to blame, and these, you've got these demographics of younger people under, 34, 35, who all believe that Iran, the regime, is the good guy and Israel's the bad guy. You've got younger people who don't believe in the Holocaust. Everything in history seems to have been rewritten. And that's really what part of it is that Israel's up against a complete rewriting of history. And that's not to say that Israel does everything right, but it is a very big part of what's been going on for the last 2.5 years, to the point where people like me are moving and leaving cities that they lived in, if not the country, I think in the future as a total. And so how do you get past and how do you break through the damage and or the continued conversation propaganda that's being spewed through universities, through proxies, through people just not learning history, through TikTok?
Yeah, you get through it by fighting through, by believing, and by effecting real change that cannot be denied, and by winning. A lot of people in the West have forgotten, about winning, about defeating your enemy, about being strong, being dominant. Those are, bad militant words in a lot of Western parlance. I mean, I know that Canada hasn't forgotten how to win in hockey. They do that most of the time very well. But in terms of, behaving like a strong, independent, and proud country, a lot of Western countries, this situation in Iran, it's very embarrassing. I mean, I look at the responses or the lack thereof of a lot of Western governments, UK, France, Germany, Canada. It's a lot of, moral cowardice. It's a lot of non-leadership from elected officials who I expected more. And it's interesting now the Brits are, waking up because the Iranians fired a long-range ballistic missile to the range of 4,000 kilometers, which the Iranian regime claimed before that they do not have and that they're limited to 2,000 kilometers. Their foreign minister repeated that lie several times, and it's been mentioned by other Iranian officials. And now they fired yesterday 2 missiles aimed at Diego Garcia, the island where the US has its strategic bombers. They didn't hit. One was intercepted and one landed at sea somewhere. But the bottom line is, now Europe is kind of sitting up a little bit more and taking notice that those Iranians have missiles that can reach Iran. What does that? That can reach European capitals, mainland Europe. It can reach the southeastern outskirts of London, and it covers Berlin, Paris, Milan, Rome, and many other places in Europe. Now, that is interesting to see, and I'm following how will the Europeans respond to this? Will this change the calculus? Because the Iranians fired those missiles towards Diego Garcia, nothing says that they won't fire them towards Europe as a means of pressuring, getting rid of the pressure that is the US and Israeli war. So when it comes to information, I think, I wish Israel would allocate sufficient resources and be as creative and excellent as Israeli soldiers and airmen and Mossad operatives are on the ground and in the air.
Right.
That we would do the same thing or have the same level of brilliance when it comes to hearts and minds and information warfare. I think that Israel, and here's the problem, we face unique levels of scrutiny and double or triple standards. No other country faces the same level of scrutiny, media scrutiny, that Israel does. Now, what Israel needs to do is to allocate the relevant resources in order to deal with that. That means spending more time, spending more money, having more talented people, and have a functioning, well-funded and well-oiled machine that does public affairs and communications on behalf of the State of Israel. That doesn't exist yet. It needs to exist, to have existed 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's urgently needed today. And as you criticize, Prime Minister Carney and as I criticize others, yeah, I have issues here with the Israeli government not prioritizing that enough. There needs to be more money, more priority, more resources, more talent, more access to intel. And then, the job of honest reporting would be easier, and we would have a better chance at getting our voice out. Now, even when we will do that, we will still face anti-Semitism. We will still face biased reporting. We will still face hatred and double standards. Those are given, but we need to equip ourselves with better tools in order to fight those better. And I agree, yeah, we have serious issues with Western politicians that are also sensitive to their Muslim voters and sentiment against Israel. They forget about their Jewish constituents because they're not as vocal, they're not as militant, they're not as bullying, and they're not as violent as the Muslims. And then you get decisions by Western governments that really are decisions of moral cowardice. Looking at how Western governments are, wobbling over the situation here in Iran, it really is embarrassing.
Well, embarrassing, if not dangerous, because, and I agree with you. We need to Mossad the communications game. And if they can Mossad the communications game, I can't imagine what it would look like. So we'll get on that. But, we have in Canada, and I don't think I need to tell you, it's not new news, although it's seemingly just being talked about now, is we have a couple of hundred, if not 700 of the top IRGC officials here in this country. And we have lots of people who should not be in this country who are dangerous, not just to Jews, but to Western values, to Canadian life as we know it, right? To the future of our country. So, the bottom line is the government has to act. They have an obligation, not just moral, but it is the Prime Minister's job to make sure that this country is safe, the national security is safe. We are not seeing anything to show that urgency. In fact, the public safety minister came out the other day and said they're acting with urgency, and they've been able to remove one person over 4 years, which, I wish I could laugh at that. But the fact is we have not just Iranian Persian Jews in danger, and they are here by the hundreds of thousands raising the warning flags. We have, Iranians having, hits put on them, but we know how dangerous this is to the Jewish community and what has happened to the Jewish community, not just in perpetuity, but certainly over the last 2.5 years. And it's getting worse, and yet no one will call it out or do anything. And I just can't imagine in the next 10 years to 20 years, because I'm always forward thinking. I think a lot of people in Israel and in the Jewish community are forward thinking of what does this look like in 20 years? The conflict will ultimately go one of which ways. I don't think it's going to end soon. I don't know where it's going to go, but in 10 to 20 years, I don't know what Canada looks like if the government doesn't act at some point with any kind of urgency.
Yeah, when you look at where the UK is going, where Belgium is going, where France, to a certain extent, parts of Germany.
Australia.
Yeah, Australia. It's not a pretty picture. It's one of a not so silent, but very clear takeover, an Islamist takeover of Western democracies through legal means, by ballots, not by bullets, but city by city, council by council, and parliament seat by parliament seat. They are focused, disciplined, and they are voting or otherwise bullying themselves in to positions of power and starting to dominate. And you can see that what Europe was 20, 30 years ago, very different picture today. And when you look forward and you assess the demographics and what will the cultural and religious balance in the UK be in a few years, in a generation from now, in France, in Belgium, in Sweden, and many other places, it's not a pretty picture. And I'm sure that it's not the picture that even the most liberal, naive, self-hating Europeans think is a good one. when it comes to their future, because it virtually means the end of their civilization. It means that a foreign alien civilization is coming in, taking control, adopting or forcing their values, their way of life, their perspective on life, their religion, their customs on what is Europe today. And it's
Right.
happening in various places. I think it's happening to a certain extent in Canada, in certain cities and neighborhoods as well.
Sure.
And it's quite sad, you know, from a Jewish perspective, what that means. Home is Israel.
Yeah, look, it's more than sad. I mean, we went to World War and the Great Wars, and we made the promise to the men and women who killed them, were killed in those, and made the sacrifices, never to forget. And we clearly have got many people in this country, certainly, who have forgotten. And so, even though, John, even if this war or this military action against Iran, the regime, even if it's short-lived, I mean, these dangers don't go away. Right. And so can you paint a picture of what the long game looks like for those intent on either, sacrificing Jews for their, monstrous beliefs, or Iranians themselves, or Western values? But what does it look like, even if, let's say, the regime fell and everything went back to normal in a couple of months, which I don't think will happen, or I hope it does. But what does it look like in the West, or in a place like Canada? Because I don't think the dangers go away.
Yeah, so let's zoom back to the Middle East for a second and speak about the Iranian regime, and we can speak a little bit about militant Islam or Islamism, jihad. If we look at the situation in Iran, it's of course impossible at this stage to know how the dust is going to settle and what the situation is going to be. My personal assessment is that the US and Israel are winning. We are defeating the Iranian regime militarily. We are degrading their military capabilities. We are denying them of the ability to resupply and replenish what they already fire. And we are negating their ability to fire at Gulf countries, at Israel, or at the US assets. And within a few weeks, I think that the US, with some assistance, will be able to open up the Hormuz Strait and clear that of international traffic. And I think that by the end of the military campaign, the Iranian regime, if it's still there, will find itself without meaningful tools by way to do damage to the US or Israel or the Gulf countries, and they'll have a lot of bad options. I also personally believe, and this is influenced by what I've seen and heard Iranians in Iran say and do, I believe that the Iranian people has had it with this regime and that they will eventually overthrow it. How long will it take? How bloody will it be? How many sacrifices will be needed? I don't know. I hope it'll be short, quick, and relatively benign. But I know that we're dealing with a very cruel and oppressive regime who desperately wants to stay in power. But I also think that the collective will of the Iranian people is larger, stronger, and hopefully when the bombs stop flying, the Iranian people will be equipped, or are already being equipped, with the means necessary in order to level the battlefield against the Iranian regime thugs, and I'm referring to weapons. So I think that this war will end eventually. The political mid or short-term outcome of this war will be that the Iranian regime will be overthrown by the Iranian people. That doesn't mean that terrorism goes away. That doesn't mean that Israel is in the clear, and it doesn't mean that the West can take a collective sigh of relief and say, well, now it's all good. It means that a very significant engine of radicalism, of terror, of violence and oppression will be at least temporarily disabled. And that's very important. But we will still have, Sunni radicalism. We will still have the Muslim Brotherhood, who are trying to take over Western societies and dominate the world, but specifically the West. We will still have different, Al-Qaeda variations and ISIS, etc. That'll still exist even when the Iranian regime is undone. But I think the halo effect, or the butterfly effect, of the fall of the Iranian regime, once it happens, will be to show Muslims around the world that there is another way, and that the way of fanaticism, of religious rule, it doesn't pay. It's a failed system, just like communism was a failed system, just like totalitarian regimes are bound to failure because they are based on sin, they're based on unjust foundations. Same thing will happen with the Islamic Republic, and I think Islamists the world over will be able to take an example for that, and it'll affect change. But to extrapolate from that and say that we're now going to enter a different stage globally speaking, I would hope so. But in Israel, and I suppose people are also interested in how this will reflect, I think what it will mean if and when Israel successfully defeats the Iranian regime is that most of our enemies will have a temporary difficulty in getting money and weapons. That's what it will mean. And eventually, I'm sure that they will overcome it, because as the saying goes, where there's a will, there's a way. If Hamas and other Arabs who call themselves Palestinians believe that it is their duty in life to fight the Jews in a holy war, in jihad, until the Jews are defeated, then they will do so with sticks and stones if they don't have Iranian weapons. What needs to change is the mindset. What needs to change is the priorities on the other side. And what needs to be different is what they prioritize, their own future or the future of their children, or trying to destroy ours.
Or they can find a foothold here in the West and rewrite the script, as we've seen, like the Al-Quds rally, March, the Hate March, which went again last week in Western countries, including Canada. And again, it's now been co-opted as a Palestinian rally, and so the language changes, and people here think, okay, well, we want to be supportive, and they don't realize what they're actually supporting, and fight and be outspoken as people were, including myself, to shut this thing down. It went on. And so this is what we're up against here in the West is, the rewriting of the script and the nuances, and the politicians too scared to take a stance because they don't want to lose the votes, to your point. So then how crucial, John, is it then that we see Saudi Arabia, right? Stepping, because clearly they don't want an expanded war, but the Arab states themselves, once we kind of get past the military actions, they will be crucial, in trying to rebuild and certainly changing the thoughts and minds and hearts of people here to fight this thing. How crucial are they to next steps?
I think they're very crucial. And I think the most important thing is victory, to defeat Iran and to make it as clear and as resounding as necessary, in order for everybody to see that when you act the way the Iranian regime has been acting, when you oppress your own people, when you misuse the resources of a people and a country, when you're corrupt, when you embezzle the future of your country, and you invest heavily in terrorism and jihad and instability and all of the things that the Iranian regime has done, that has consequences. And I think that victory here is going to be very important, because everybody will want to be part of the victory. The Saudis, the Emiratis, even the two-faced Qataris, they will want to be part of the victorious side. And I think that's why it's so important that this war ends in a very clear way, where the Islamic Republic is not only defeated militarily, but defeated politically. That's why I think it's so important, because, the regime, if they exist the day that there's a ceasefire signed, they will claim victory. They will spin and tell stories as if they won, as if they dictated the terms, never mind that their country will be in ruins and that their military industry will be gone and their nuclear weapons program will be gone and everything else will be gone. But they will still say that they won, and I want to deny them that. I want them not to exist as a political entity, so as not to have any dilemma whatsoever. And then regional countries, Saudis and others, it'll be a very clear situation for them to follow up on. And these countries have a lot of influence when it comes to the Palestinians, when it comes to the situation in Gaza, Judea and Samaria, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They can influence that a lot, and they can perhaps do what many others have failed, and that is to tell the Palestinians that enough with your rejectionism, enough with playing the victim, enough with saying no and refusing Israeli peace offers, and now you have one last offer, take it, or you will forever be without our support. And it is connected, right? The whole move here, the whole war in the Middle East here between Israel and the US and Iran, it will have a halo effect on the Palestinians as well and on the conflict as well. And I'm very hopeful that it will be a positive one where important dominoes will fall that will eventually, shape a Middle East that is much better, that is more peaceful, that has less conflict, that has more prosperity, more chances of coexistence. And maybe people listening, they'll maybe, doubt what I'm saying and question it. But in terms of, with the Palestinians, let's be clear. Israel has offered the Palestinians 4 different peace deals and has said officially with maps, here, take 98% of Judea and Samaria, have a capital in Eastern Jerusalem, and let's just call it quits. You recognize us, we recognize you, let's coexist, let's move on with it. But that's been rejected by various Palestinian leaders. And I think what needs to happen is for people to understand that, it's artificially sustained, this ongoing forever war in the Middle East between Arabs and Israelis, specifically Palestinians. It is artificially sustained, and one of the artificial sustainers is the Iranian regime. There are others. There's European countries, there's UN institutions, but Iran has really been pouring a lot of gasoline on the fire here. And if and when they will be taken out of the equation, that'll be a positive thing, regionally speaking, as well.
You did mention Qatar, and again, it's one of those strategic allies that we need, and yet not an ally in kind of any sense of the word, because they very much are a funder of terror, of Hamas. It's a double-edged sword. What role are they going to play? I mean, they're not an ally, but they are. So what do you do with a problem like Qatar in this?
Yeah, I question why they are an ally of the US and of the West. I don't think they behave like an ally. I think they behave like a treacherous, malicit influence in the West. They are basically the bank account of the Muslim Brotherhood. They are a country that rules by power over a large majority of modern-day slaves, foreign workers, a small minority of extremely wealthy local Bedouins who are the Qataris. And they're a country that, their contribution to or to their statue as allies, I think is very questionable. It was interesting to see as the military buildup was going on with U.S. assets in the region before the U.S. and Israel launched the strike. A lot of planes and assets were flown in from Europe and from the US and from Asia to the Middle East and forward positioned in the Middle East, various American locations in the Middle East. One base was virtually emptied of American assets, and that is the very important strategic El Udeid Air Base in Qatar, in Doha. Now, that I think is very telling, because if I were an American and I pay tax, my tax dollars were spent on having infrastructure in a foreign country, I would want that infrastructure to be there and to be relevant for when I need it. Obviously, El Udeid wasn't relevant. It didn't serve the purposes of the US. It didn't serve its military buildup, and it was actually more of a liability to the US. And that's one, if not the biggest reason that people around the world continue to explain why Qatar is important, because El Udeid, well, when push came to shove, El Udeid wasn't important. It was depleted of its assets, and the Qataris were not important and didn't contribute to the war effort here. And I think that needs to be taken into consideration when the dust settles, and for the relationship between the US and the West and Qatar to be reevaluated. They are not friends. They are not allies. They are deceivers, and they are a country that supports the biggest propaganda machine in the world, probably Al Jazeera, which is a state-sponsored terrorism incitement racket. That is how I define Al Jazeera. It's in fancy British English, and it's very well polished, and it's nice editing and lots of talent and well-paid media workers, but that is what they do. They propagate for terrorism. They undermine stability. They propagate for Muslim Brotherhood worldviews and for jihad, whether it's against Israel or against the West. Those are very negative things, and that all is sanctioned by and paid by the Qatari government. And I think it's high time that the West reevaluates its relationship. I saw where Prime Minister Carney is in terms of Qatar. Not a good look.
Well, there's a few positions of the last few years that are not a good look, and the point is, I don't even know what stance that we would take at this point because of where we stand or don't stand, and I'm not even sure what the position of Canada is, because there's been so much politicization since certainly October 7th. You know, I think the concern has been more about the vote opposed to what is best for the future of this country. Having said all that, can we actually say, and can you comfortably say that we are safer now without Ayatollah, right? Are we safer now with what has been achieved by Israel and United States? Or are we not going to be safe until the regime itself is all gone? Can you make a determination as to, is the world a safer place? I have no tears to shed over any of the regime being taken out. I think it's a good day when an Iranian regime member is taken out, but I might not be seeing this the right way. So correct me where I'm wrong, but are we safer today than we were?
Yeah, my perspective is that we are definitely in the short term safer today, for the simple reason that every day that goes by, the Iranian regime is stripped of significant military capabilities and of their ability to build them in the future. So definitely yes, that's a clear yes. The question is,
so are there?
for how
I
long?
just want to clarify, because they do have long-term missiles, as you pointed out, and they can reach European shores. But do they not? Are they militarily, as far as nuclear weapons, is that now not a concern for the short term?
Yeah, so that's exactly the next point, and the very important thing about Iran's clandestine nuclear weapons program, which they cultivated for more than 20 years, spent tremendous resources into both hiding, hardening, and advancing that program. It's been undone by Israel and the US, and it'll take them very, very long years even to get that back into some kind of working order, if at all. And that is, that's a very tangible addition to global safety and global stability. That regime having been checked in terms of their ability to actually pursue their strategic objective and to achieve weapons of mass destruction. So that's another clear yes. The question, though, is how long will it last? And if the regime isn't taken out and replaced by the Iranian people, what will it do? Judging by how they speak and what they say, they seem to be, arrogant and corrupt enough to, if they're left with the power to do so, to actually go back to doing what they did before: ballistic missiles, drones, and nuclear weapons. And I think that's why it's so important that this war doesn't end in a tie. It doesn't end in a situation where there's the possibility for the regime to do that. It ends with the undoing of the regime, because if it's not undone, it'll go back to doing the horrible things that they've been doing for the last 30, 40 years. And that's not a good situation.
The Iranian people themselves are unbelievable. The strength and the determination of the bravery, and it doesn't get talked a lot about, out here in the West, John. I mean, for the last how many weeks, how many tens of thousands have been killed just taking to the streets to have basic freedoms, and they don't get their story, I think, told enough. And certainly we see the numbers in places like Toronto, where you've got 400,000 Jews and Iranians walking together in solidarity. And again, I think there's a misunderstanding or just a lack of knowledge that those marching after October 7th, you know, are for the Iranian regime, and then you've got this whole other massive diaspora who are against. And why is it that that doesn't get recognized, right? Where we have such a massive population that doesn't seem to understand what side they should be on, and therefore they seem to be choosing the wrong side. But I mean, it's almost like you want to speak on behalf of the Iranian diaspora to say, no, these are the Iranians we want to back. And I don't think they feel that they are getting that backing.
No, I think I've heard and spoken with a lot of Iranians outside of Iran who are extremely frustrated. They speak about the double standards, the hypocrisy. They speak about the fickle hearts of Western media who are eager to, you know, blow out of proportion any story of human suffering when it relates to Arabs and Palestinians versus Israel, but seem indifferent when it comes to very legitimate, blatant injustices that are being done against the Iranian people. Women, gays, minorities, political dissidents, basically anybody who isn't on par with the regime faces extremely cruel treatment. And what I've heard a lot of brave, beautiful Iranian men and women say, you know, enough with the hypocrisy. If you, as a person, as a Westerner, say that you claim that you care about human rights, you should care about my human rights and those of my family as well. You should care about Iranian protesters wanting freedom, wanting basic liberties, wanting dignity, wanting the freedom of expression, and the very basic things that we so take for granted in the West. But that isn't what many of them have received, and that is sad. But, you know, the positive side here is that I think that the Iranian people is so strong, so brave, and understands that now is the time. This is the once in a lifetime opportunity. It will be for the Iranian people to take back their country from this foreign foreign rule of Islamist leaders. And I hope that they'll be able to do so. I hope that they will be able to seize the opportunity and weather the storm and tough it through. And all credit to them for, you know, the bravery that they have displayed so far, and I think they will do in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big goal. I think, you know, in this click and deliver world we live in, where instant results are what we expect. What is the expectation? I mean, we've been at this moment, I think, a few times in history, certainly where the Iranian people are it's up to them to get the will to move forward, but we just can't seem to get past that. Do you truly feel, is this the moment that could be the breakthrough for the Iranian people? Because it's not going to happen overnight, certainly. And I think that's what people are expecting. That'll be,
Yeah,
you know,
at this day
down
and
and
age,
gone, right? Yeah.
yeah, we want everything instant. That's how we're become accustomed to. When we shop on Amazon, we
Yep.
click once and everything needs
Wouldn't it
to
be nice if
happen.
we could do that? Just click for peace. I'll take peace, right?
Yeah, click for peace, click for human rights, click
Yeah.
for prosperity. It would be great. And
Yep.
someone else take care of the messy business behind the scenes. The someone taking care of the messy business behind the scenes, by the way, is Israel. That's what Israel and the US are doing. And yes, I have hope. I have hope. And I think that the Iranian regime crossed the Rubicon and became illegitimate in the eyes of the Iranian people by the way that they slaughtered between 32 and 42,000 Iranians. That was that was one bridge too many. That was the final straw, and there is no coming back for the Iranian regime. It may be short and swift, it may take a while, but I think at the end, the Iranian people are not going to tolerate it. And what Israel and the US are doing is degrading. We are degrading the existing command and control and oppression capabilities so that when the war ends, it'll be easier for the Iranian people to rise up.
As we you know, chat with Honest Reporting Canada, and sadly we need this now to make sure that we can actually get the truth out or break through some of the propaganda. What would be, I guess, one of the more important things, you know, that you would want to impart in this conversation that's not getting through, or something you think people aren't getting or understanding here?
I think, you know, people who are intelligent, what I ask people to do is the classic thing of walking a few miles in another person's shoes. That's, I think, would be very illustrative for a lot of people. Put themselves in an Israeli position, put themselves in the position of an Iranian woman, put themselves in the position of a Lebanese non-Shiite who is sick and tired of Hezbollah dictating the future, and think, you know, what they would think. I do that many times. I try to put myself in the position of my enemies and people who think adversaries and people who think different, to try to understand and make sense of what they're saying and thinking. And I would suggest people do that, especially with people that they don't agree with. So if it's people who, you know, hate Trump and everything he does is bad in their point of view, try for a second to, you know, to listen to what's being said and take things at more to heart, and maybe get a more balanced point of view. And I think that's what a lot of Canadians, not people watching this who probably get it from my perspective, but a lot of Canadians, they're missing out on that. And it's a very monochromatic worldview where Israel bad, Trump bad, and anything against those, well, by default, that's good.
Yeah, well, history's not neat and tidy. It never has been. As long as we don't keep rewriting it and people start learning it and not forgetting it, I think, you know, I truly believe that in a moment like this, we've got to remember what we claim to not forget, because it's vital, I think, to the future of our safety, not just for our generation or for Jews or Israelis, but so many people that we claim, you know, bring us strength to our country. I mean, if diversity is our strength, then we need to start standing up for it. And frankly, we're not seeing that right now. John, can't thank you enough for your time on this.
Thank you very much. A pleasure, and shalom from Israel.
Thank you again, Jonathan, for sharing your insight and perspective with us tonight, and to Alex for leading such a thoughtful and important conversation. We covered a lot of ground: the connection to October 7th and how this broader conflict has unfolded, the role of misinformation and information warfare in shaping global understanding, and the difficult but critical question of what it means to actually defeat an enemy in a conflict like this. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Please stay connected with HR Canada Charitable Organization for future conversations and analysis. Have a good evening.